the differentiation between a moderate Muslim and a reform-minded Muslim is an interesting one. Where I would differ with Irshad is that the bold reinterpretation of the verses that talk about violence have already occurred. They occurred with the terrorists. The terrorists are reinterpreting these verses. The original classical interpretation is the one the moderates, if we're calling them that, are using to in fact respond. The underlying premise, the underlying fundamental issue where I think we differ, though we might agree on many things, are the terrorists using the authentic, orthodox interpretation of the verses that we now need to reinterpret because look what they're causing? Or in fact, are they the reformists? Are the terrorists in fact reinterpreting the verses to justify what they're doing? What I am saying is that when you analyze the rhetoric, when you look at Muslim opinion around the world, who are for the vast majority sticking to a traditional orthodox interpretation, what you get is they are the minority and they are the ones reinterpreting and innovating, used in the wrong way, what the Quran and the classical orthodox interpretations of those verses. Why I say that is because when they issue statements for the public consumption, for the majority consumption, not their own inner group, but for other people for everybody, they do not use those verses to justify their actions. In fact, if you look at the verse that they stick to and repeat over and over, it's the one that simply says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then they go on to say, this means because America has killed 12 million Muslims, this is their calculation, that we then can kill 12 million Americans. So they use a verse that everyone understands to mean some kind of, equal justice, and then interpret it in this way. They don't use the verses that are usually cited as ones of, kill the infidel wherever you see them. Because the classical, orthodox, the ones that you find at Al-Azhar or any other classical, traditional seat of Muslim knowledge is totally different from the way they're interpreting it. So my fundamental difference with Irshad is the evidence does not support that these verses in their classical orthodox interpretation are motivating the terrorists. The terrorists are in fact themselves reinterpreting those verses. So when moderates respond, of course they're not going to reinterpret the verses to tell them they're wrong. They're simply saying Islam is against this in its classical traditional understanding. The second part of your question was what is a moderate Muslim? Again,
how do you count them?
How do I count them? Well, we have to first define them. My definition of a mainstream Muslim is one who does not believe in violence. You can have any kind of theological outlook you want. You can be reform-minded, you can be very conservative, you can be very traditional, as long as you stick to the universally accepted standards of human rights when it comes to targeting civilians. You fall into this category. Now that category, I don't actually like the word moderate Muslim, even though I used it in my book. I prefer mainstream Muslim because moderate Muslim implies moderately Muslim, being less passionate about faith than the extremists, who are the real zealots. But with other religious people who, whether they're Jewish or Christian, they hate the word moderate Christian, moderate Jew. I am not moderate, I am passionate about moderation.
Irshad, quick response, and then I want to move on to just one other subject.
Well, I mean, you make a very compelling case, Dalia, for, you know, why it is not necessary nor even desirable to be reinterpreting passages that, in fact, the terrorists, as you claim, are reinterpreting. Therefore, we must sort of, you know, just return to the classical interpretation. But 2 points about that. One is clearly the classical interpretation didn't convince them. You know, and therefore, we have to actually, like it or not, pay attention to the reality on the ground that there is a small but very, very disproportionately powerful group of people that is, in fact, doing harm to the faith of Islam and to real people, both Muslim and non-Muslim. To simply say they're the ones who are wrong and we're the ones who are right isn't going to save anybody from their harm. Therefore, it is important to take what they have been doing and then figure out, and I'm not a theologian, so I'm not the one who's going to be doing this, but figure out what it is that they have been doing wrong vis-a-vis interpretation and clarify that for the vast majority of Muslims. But here's the problem. Okay, but here's the problem. In fact, Muslim theologians have not been doing that. I mean, I know that you say that they have, but I've read exactly what you've read. I come away with a very, very different conclusion. And I'll just give you, again, quick and concrete example. You know, chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran expressly states that if you kill a human being, it is like killing all of mankind. But here's the kicker. Here's the catch. Unless you kill that human being as punishment for murder or other villainy in the land. That clause, beginning with the word except, has become an escape hatch for terrorists. They use exactly those words, and I'll tell you something. Every time I go to a moderate cleric to ask him, you know, and it is a him all the time, right? Tell me what you do with those words, I only hear nothing. Literally, we do nothing with those words. Well, the problem with doing nothing is some other people are doing something with them. That's why they have to be reinterpreted.
But I've studied classical Quranic interpretation, and that except verse refers to capital punishment by the state after a trial. It refers specifically to the state's right to capital punishment if someone actually commits murder. That is what the classical interpretation is. And so the fact that the clerics you've spoken to haven't been able to respond with something like that and haven't been able to get their voices out to young people who are reading that verse and thinking that it means vigilantism, that they can go and haphazardly choose who they want to kill, is certainly not the fault. The answer isn't reinterpreting. The reinterpretation has already occurred by those who have taken it and used it in their own way without knowledge. The point is, this is the problem of lack of religious literacy, that these young people can be preyed on by people with political motivation.
But doesn't that suggest to you that moderates have to get more active then?
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, okay.
Okay, which is why I say we've got to raise our bar higher, okay? The search for moderates ought to be a search for reform-minded Muslims.
Irshad, what I want to do is ask one more quick question, both of you, then we're going to go to some questions in the audience. And by the way, I have to say that I find this so refreshing because I'm usually on panels of only Jews yelling at each other. So I feel as if I can go get a drink or something and come back and we'd just be fine. Everything will be fine. The final question is
we've corrupted Islam in our yelling at each other. I understand.
The final question I have for you is the practical question, which is what is to be done to get the United States out of the problem that we have with large swaths of the Muslim world, a smaller swath that's actively engaged in terrorism, a larger swath that doesn't seem to like us very much. Irshad, you seem to be arguing that the answer lies within Islam, and that a reform within Islam will help lift us up out of these problems. Dalia, based on what I've read from your book and your studies, you seem to think that concrete foreign policy changes on the part of the United States and the West will ameliorate these issues. 1 minute each, deal with those, 1 minute really, and then we'll have time for some questions. Dalia?
My minute hasn't started.
Your minute hasn't started.
Okay.
There's too much rumination, obviously. That's another problem.
I want to make a case for the danger of fixing what is considered not broken. i.e. the classical understanding of Islam, is that once we open the door of reinterpretation of verses that have already been clearly interpreted to not promote violence as understood by the vast majority of Muslims who would consider themselves traditional or orthodox and not reform-minded, is that opening this process of ijtihad of the non-licensed it gives credibility to those who interpret those verses today in an unorthodox way to justify violence. When we say it's okay to open this up, then they will say, well, now that we've democratized ijtihad, great. Our interpretation is just as good as Sheikh Ali Goma, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, who has told us for all this time that these verses don't mean violence. Now we're all on equal footing. He has 30 years of scholarship, we have none, but we are equal in our ability to tell the ummah what Islam is telling them to do. So I would go back to, we have licenses for selling real estate. And my call to all of us is to have enough respect for Islamic scholarship to consider it equal to the medical field, where you need to go to school and get a license before you write a prescription.
Deal very quickly with my question on the concrete solution to
Yes,
the problem.
The concrete solution. What is happening, according to our analysis, is that people become politically radicalized, according to their own words, not mine, and then take on religion as a mobilizing and justifying accessory to the actions that they want to commit. So we have to deal with the issue at its core. The core are political issues. And instead of trying to reformulate Islam, which should be the job of Muslims and not America, we should instead give people an alternative, because the real battle going on in the Muslim world is not a battle over the soul of Islam. It is a battle about the road to reform. People want change. We have to let them have options toward that change that don't involve violence. Valid and viable options to a different way into the future.
Ershad, very quickly.
Agreed that foreign policy has to change, but not in the conventional way that you're always told about. It's not just about Israel-Palestine. It is also about, for example, liberating the entrepreneurial talents of women in the Muslim world through microfinance, something that Dalia referred to. And it's a policy plank that I believe all rich countries around the world, including rich Arab countries, ought to be buying into. We talked about the Prophet Muhammad's life, and Dalia quite rightly pointed out, it's how you interpret his life that matters, not just the facts on the ground. Well, one of the ways that Muslim women in Southeast Asia, thanks to the Grameen Bank, which is the bank that Muhammad Yunus started to give loans to the poorest of the world's poor, one of the ways they've been using or interpreting the Prophet Muhammad's life is by reminding their husbands that the Prophet Muhammad himself was married to a wealthy, self-made businesswoman for whom the Prophet worked for many, many years. She was his boss. And so, my dear husband, if you are going to be a pious Muslim man, you won't just grow a long beard. You'll be very open to letting me work for myself. And that is an idea, a big idea, if I may say, at this festival, that the next U.S. administration